Hello and welcome to the fifth lesson in our Inspector Calls GCSE revision series. What we're doing here is basically giving you a booster on everything you need to know about the characters, the themes, potentially weaving in a little bit of context for an Inspector Calls. And so far in the last 4 weeks, we've gone through Mr. Burling, Eric, Eva, and the Inspector. And today we'll go through Gerald. So if you haven't seen any of those previous videos, I highly recommend looking at them if you're sitting this exam this year or next year or the year after, because what I'm doing is giving you loads of key quotes, model paragraphs, things that you need to excel in your exams. So let's dive straight in. So what I always do first is go through the character, who they are, what they represent, that sort of thing. So we'll do that with Gerald. So I'm going to mix it up a bit today. I'm going to start with what Gerald does and then go through what he represents, just to mix it up for myself, if nothing else. So Gerald is the son of a wealthy business owner, a wealthy upper class capitalist called Lord Croft. There's Lord Croft and Lady Croft, yeah. So they're titled individuals, very wealthy, very prosperous company. And Gerald is planning to marry Sheila Burling. So the Burling family is the main family, obviously, in the play. And Gerald is planning to marry her. And we get the sense that it's perhaps slightly an arranged marriage, at least in some parts, particularly probably more so for Gerald. Sheila seems to genuinely love Gerald. Gerald shows signs that perhaps he doesn't truly love Sheila. One of the most obvious ones is he meets the victim of the play, Eva Smith, when she is prostituting herself in a bar called the Palace Bar in Bromley, which is where it's set, which is a northern town in England. He meets her. Her name at that point is Daisy Renton. That's her working name, shall we say. And he ends up having an affair with her. So during the affair, he provides her with all of the things that socialism argues for, and perhaps even socially responsible capitalism, to be totally fair. So he gives her money, he gives her food, he gives her shelter. And so there's this irony to Gerald, because he's from a family that wouldn't want necessarily to give the working class any social security, as we now call it, welfare, that sort of thing, money basically to help them as they're looking for a job and building skills and that sort of thing. Gerald gives her all of those things, even though he comes from a family that technically says that they aren't for those things. But he does show her genuine kindness. And we get the sense when he's being interrogated by the inspector that he truly is in love with Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton. Yeah, he's actually in love with her. It's a bit tragic because we get the sense that he has to marry Sheila for the arrangement of the Burling company, which is obviously Arthur Burling, Mr. Burling's company, to kind of merge and agree with the Crofts Limited company, which is Gerald's family's company. So it's a bit of an arranged marriage, we get the sense. And he definitely seemed to love Daisy Renton, because when he finds out that she's died, he gets sort of grief-stricken. He has to excuse himself from the room and goes off. And then the play carries on. And we don't see Gerald for a while. So we feel a little bit sorry for Gerald, potentially, because he does seem like he really did love this woman. And the tragedy is he couldn't be with her because of the fact that she was working class and he's upper class. And weaved into that, we also get the sense that Gerald isn't even fully supported by his family, even marrying Sheila. And Sheila is an upper class woman, young woman. But Lord and Lady Croft are not at this engagement party that the play starts with. And apparently it's because they're away on business or away on holiday. But we get the sense that maybe they're not there because they don't fully support the union, the marriage of Gerald and Sheila. So it seems more that the way that Arthur Burling, Mr. Burling, speaks about it, it seems more like he's almost arranged it a little bit on the side, because he's always talking about how happy he is that Gerald is marrying into the family, that Gerald is like the son he never had. Imagine how that makes his son Eric feel. And that once they're married, like the companies will merge together and compete and stop competing, and they'll just be able to work together for higher prices and lower costs. So trying to screw their workers even more out of even more money, but also screw their customers to pay even more money. So yeah, then Gerald comes back at the end of the play in Act 3, and he's had to think about everything. And we think that Gerald is quite a hopeful character. We think that Gerald might learn from his mistakes in the same way that Eric does and Sheila does, because Gerald is the bridge between the younger generation and the older generation, really. Yeah. But he doesn't. He comes back in and he actually says, I think that the inspector was a fraud. I think that there were many women that were affected by each of us, and that he's just created this story that it's all the same girl to make it more tragic. And he's like, I bet there isn't even a woman that died in the infirmary, and I'm not even sure that Inspector Gould was really a police officer. So Eric and Sheila, as he's saying this, they're like, well, it doesn't really matter whether there really was an inspector or not. The truth is that we all did do those horrible things to potentially different women, or maybe the same woman, but either way, we should learn from that mistake. Whereas Gerald, sadly, when he comes back in, once he feels that he might get away with what's happened, he doesn't take responsibility. So he is quite a tragic character, because we feel like maybe he will have learned something and grown and developed, but actually he doesn't grow or develop as a result. And then obviously it's quite sad at the very end when the phone call comes and it turns out a girl has just died in the infirmary from swallowing the disinfectant, and an inspector's on the way. We get the sense that Gerald, had this opportunity to learn but didn't, the same as Mr. Burling, same as Mrs. Burling. Okay, so that's what Gerald does in the play. Let's look at what he sort of represents. So as I already sort of mentioned, he represents the bridge between the older generation and the younger generation. So Gerald isn't quite as young as Eric and Sheila, but he isn't as old as Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling. So he's sort of that middle ground, that bridge. And tragically, as I say, he sort of sides with the older generation, sides with greed, sides with, just not trying to help the working class. And there's this irony to that, because he literally helped Daisy Renton in all the ways that would count as social responsibility, with food and clothing and shelter, like I said. When he was face to face with someone who needed him, he actually treated them very nicely. But now he doesn't want to take responsibility for his actions, or at the end, should I say. He represents another capitalist family. So like I said, he's from Crofts Limited. So there's Crofts Limited is one company, and then there's Burling Company, which is Mr. Burling's company. So they're the two companies. He represents the upper class. Clearly, he represents like really the upper class, because his parents are lord and lady, so like super high up. He's a rounded, dynamic deuteragonist. We do feel a great sense of pathos for Gerald. He's a complicated character. There's a lot that goes on in him. And he is dynamic to some extent, but in a negative way. He doesn't grow from his experiences. If anything, he ultimately falls from his experiences. I wouldn't say he's on a full arc. Maybe he is. You could look into that a bit more and think about it. I think that he certainly is a tragic character in that sense, though. And that's what I said in the last bit. He represents hope, but then also tragedy. Okay, so we've got some quotes to go through with Gerald. There's loads more quotes on Gerald as well, but these are some of my favorite ones. So I'll go a bit deeper into some of these, and then we'll do a model paragraph to finish. So I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. So Gerald, like Eric, and like Arthur, really, at certain points, show sort of a little bit of misogynistic viewpoints on women. This is probably one of the worst things about Gerald, outside of the fact that he doesn't want to take responsibility. So it's a good thing to understand that Gerald really did care about Daisy Renton, really did seem to love her. But we do get the sense that one of the reasons that is because Eva Smith was described as being extremely beautiful. And so part of it is still greed, the fact that he's doing these things maybe at least subconsciously, if not fully consciously, because he fancies her, basically. And with other women, he calls them hard-eyed and dough-faced. So he doesn't have this appeal to them. He talks about how he doesn't come into the suicide business. Now, this actually parallels Mr. Burling. And this maybe forebodes the fact that he will not ultimately take responsibility for what he did. So this is when he's talking to Sheila. He says, look, just let's keep it quiet from the inspector. He tries to deceive the inspector. He tries not to even let the inspector know that he knew a Daisy Renton. He says, look, I don't come into this suicide business. So it parallels Mr. Burling. He's trying to shirk his responsibility. He's trying to get his fiancée to cover this up as well. And that's then doubly devious, really, right? Because by trying to get Sheila to cover up that he knew Daisy Renton, he's also getting his fiancée to cover up his affair. But obviously it doesn't work. He does have the affair. Sheila does find out about it. Sheila does return his engagement ring back to him. But we get this sense of deception from that quote, the fact that he doesn't want to tell the inspector. He doesn't want to face his responsibility. Sorry, I've suddenly realized, taken it in properly, that she's dead. So this quote shows that he truly is shaken up. Hyphenation really helps to show that he's very shaken up, and he doesn't want to. This seems spontaneous and real, basically. He isn't strategizing. He isn't trying to think about what's best for himself and the way that he speaks here. He's speaking, at least for now, from the heart. He realizes that she's dead. Eva Smith is dead. Daisy Renton is dead. And he is genuinely shaken by it. And this is sort of the opportunity that Gerald has for what we would call a redemption arc. So he has this opportunity to redeem himself at the end by saying, you know what, I didn't do right by Daisy Renton, and I'll never do that again, and I'll try and help. But he doesn't do that redemption arc, right? As I say, so it's not quite a full arc, it's just not a redemption arc. But there's the hyphenation, it's very spontaneous and real, and it shows that he's stuck, like he's really trying to work out what to say or how to feel right now. So we get this sense of his humanity here. I didn't install her there so I could make love to her. Now, this is an interesting quote because we're not sure whether this is true or not, really. It seems plausible that he really cared about her, yeah? So I think that he did. And I think, you know, the inspector even asks him outright. He says, were you in love with her? And he says, I don't know. I didn't feel the way that she did about me. He's dodging the question. He did love her, I think, it's fair to say. And so when he says, I didn't install Daisy Renton in the housing that my friend had lent me, I think they were called Morgan Terrace, he's saying, look, I didn't do it just to sleep with her. So we get this sense that there was a deeper connection and a deeper feeling between them. But unfortunately, as much as it was a fantasy for Eva Smith to be looked after for a while and to actually be comfortable, it was also a fantasy for him because he was really sleeping with and having an affair with a woman that he knew deep down he couldn't marry unless he broke the class divides of the time, Edwardian England, the class divides, married her for love and gave up his inheritance. Because Lord and Lady Croft, believe you me, they wouldn't have allowed him to marry a working class girl. They'd have cut him off because they would want to protect their wealth for the rest of their family and for the Croft name, because surnames meant a lot back then, much more than they do now. It's a favorite haunt of women of the town. This is interesting as well because Gerald doesn't shy away from the fact that he's literally in a bar, the Palace Bar, which he knows is a place where there are prostitutes. It's kind of unusual, and it's something that a lot of students don't talk about, which I would recommend you do. We're not in Victorian gentleman territory here, right? Like when you're doing your Victorian novel for your GCSE, you can talk about Victorian gentlemen or Victorian society, high society, all that stuff, especially if you're doing like Christmas Carol, which I've got videos for, check them out, or Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, which I've also got videos for, check them out. So Victorian gentlemen had to be very rigidly like appropriate, but they weren't. They would go off to brothels and sleep with prostitutes, and they would go to opium dens and smoke opium, which is heroin, and they would go to bars and get drunk, but they would just try and cover it all up. Gerald is exposing the fact that the Edwardian gentleman, you know, was the same. He would go and drink in bars that he knew there were women of the town in. So it's interesting because it's like, it's refreshingly, it's honest and direct, but also juxtaposes the image of him as a Prince Charming, I suppose you'd say. And I think that Sheila doesn't use that exact reference, but she does call him a prince sarcastically. He says, "Oh, you were the, the prince of everything. You must have loved it, Gerald." So the fact that the prince, so-called, is actually going off and drinking in bars with prostitutes shows he's not a prince. Appearance versus reality, yeah, that sort of thing. Good quote again. Everything's all right now, Sheila. This is kind of just hilarious, isn't it? At the end, it's very jarring for the audience. And it shows that Gerald hasn't learned anything in the long run, unfortunately, because now that he thinks that Daisy Renton didn't die, the fact that he had an affair with another woman doesn't seem to bother him. He's just like, it's all right, take the ring back, let's get married. So there's this weird, almost psychopath kind of nature, or maybe not psychopath, but like sociopath nature of the Burlings and of Gerald. They're like, look, nothing happened, it's fine, we're going to be fine, let's just carry on as if nothing happened. It's this weird ignorance, this weird deliberate ignorance that they're putting forward. And then finally, all right, I knew her, let's leave it at that. So this quote in some ways could belong up with this one. Because once he's found out, rather than just admitting it and saying what's happened, he doesn't want to do that. So instead he says, short sentences, very private. He wants to try and keep this all under wraps. And again, that parallels Mr. Burling and Mrs. Burling. So from a young boy, Gerald's probably been trained to not really talk about these things in public, because there's the public face of the family and he doesn't want to jeopardize that. Okay, so those are the quotes. We've got plenty of time to do a model paragraph, which is nice for once, a little bit more comfortable than usual. If you have any questions or comments, please do comment down below. If you're liking this content, please do give me a thumbs up or consider subscribing. That really helps. It's really helpful to see this going out to more people. So let's talk about Gerald. How is he presented and why is he significant? So as usual, the beginning bit here where I give you a few ideas, these are some of the points that you could use to write some paragraphs. So I like the idea of the fact that Gerald represents the bridge between the older generation and the younger generation. I really like that one. So I'm going to do that one because I'm making the video, so I can do whatever I want, basically. I think it's also a helpful paragraph for you. So one of the ways in which Gerald is presented to the reader as significant is as a bridge between the thinking and views of the older generation of the Burlings and the younger generation of their children. In the in the interrogation of Gerald, we see hope that he will learn and grow as Eric and Sheila did, realizing, oops, got that wrong, and realize that what he did to Daisy Renton was wrong. We get the sense that he will, here we go. Actually, I'll just put the quote in. So sorry, Daisy, what he did to Daisy Renton was wrong in the quote. Sorry, well, I've suddenly realized, taking it improperly, that she's dead. I think I'll actually just put a full stop at the end of that, because I don't want to do too long a sentence. The use of hyphenation shows the shock and spontaneity of Gerald's reaction to the news that Daisy was dead. And so we have hope that the kindness he showed Daisy will now help him learn to be kinder to other working class people. However, at the end of the play, Gerald clearly has not learned anything. You see this in the quote. It's all right now, Sheila. Everything's all right now, Sheila. There we go. Since now that he believes Daisy isn't dead, he wants to carry on as if nothing happened at all. As the reader, we feel very sorry, or as the reader, we feel very let down by Gerald, since we felt pathos for him as he left saddened, but now see he has ultimately sided with the older generation and a lack of responsibility. So the only other thing we need to add in here is a little bit of context. Most of you will need to add context. This is significant because it forebodes World War I and II, since the inspector, when leaving, says, "We will learn in fire and blood and anguish." For the post-war audience, this message would push them to consider socialism more, as they had just suffered through those wars. Okay, cool. So that is a model paragraph for Gerald. So we're thinking about Gerald's character, how it's presented, why he's significant. This bridge, like I said, we've got a few quotes. They explain how ultimately he's a bit more of a tragic character, and then we link it to some context. So yeah, I think that's pretty strong. So I hope that was helpful. Like I said, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you've got any comments, questions, please leave them down below. I will see you in the next one.